We good to go, Roy? I guess silence is a virtue here. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our first Men's Club meeting in person. Thank you for braving the traffic and coming to listen to the wonderful discussion that we're going to be having tonight. The people versus Abraham. I assure you're in for a great treat tonight. Just a few points here of introduction. Jimmy Taus will be our prosecutor tonight, our very own Jimmy Taus, who's a extremely established professor, lawyer, and Torah scholar as well. Then we have the Honorable Cole running our whole discussion tonight. And by the way, anyone gets out of line, I think she has something in store for you guys. And by the way, everyone here is going to be part of the jury. So listen carefully. Your vote, you can sway the jury either way in the decision tonight. And then without a long introduction, we have the great Professor Alan Dershowitz as our defending attorney tonight. And, I want to just set a thought here. There's no real win or lose, even though we're going to have a trial. But everyone here to learn about the Akedah. And it's something I think everybody's aware. We read this on Rosh Hashanah, so it's very appropriate in timing. And we should be wrapping up about 7:30. Professor Dershowitz, by the way, will be on Zoom. He'll be up on this very large screen here. So you'll be able to follow today's discussion. With that being said, I'm going to first start off by telling you that we're also having a tribute to Rabbi Dershowitz tonight. And I'm going to actually ask our technology team to roll a video actually from Rabbi Wolpe, who cannot be here tonight, but just a real short message. So let me ask to roll the message from Rabbi Wolpe.
I'm sorry that I'm not there to join you in these deliberations and to watch the very learned and able counsel. I'm especially sorry because I actually know the right answer to this question, but I don't want to prejudice the deliberations by letting you know in advance what the verdict should be. I will tell you this, though, something very interesting that I learned many years ago, which is the Kotzker Rebbe said the hardest part of the Akedah for Abraham was coming down the mountain, because that's when he had to live for the rest of his life with the choices he had made. And I think there's deep wisdom in that, whatever you think about the culpability of the various parties in this fascinating and endlessly interesting story. I also just want to say a quick word about how glad we are that Rabbi Dershowitz is feeling well, and how grateful we are for his continuing presence and inspiration among us. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I will be back very soon and look forward to hearing about it. Take care.
So let's, there's a short video before we begin tonight's program, just kind of looking at Rabbi Dershowitz's accomplishments and what he's brought to our community. So I'll ask Roy and team to roll that out, and I believe right after that we'll have some comments from Professor Dershowitz himself.
To life, l'chaim, 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 to life. Here's to the father I've tried to be.
Here's to my bride to be.
Bring l'chaim to life, l'chaim. L'chaim, to life. Life has a way of confusing us.
Blessing and bruising us.
Bring l'chaim to life. God would like...
I had a wonderfully rich family, and I'm not talking about money, I'm talking about culture, I'm talking about a happy life Jewishly, but also in sports. I used to play soccer. My parents sent me to ski when I was 8 years old in the Carpathian Mountains with a group of kids. I was the youngest of them, and a Jewish identity, the synagogue every week, and very happy times.
So how did you pass down the learning of Judaism and the traditions of Judaism?
Well, I had an advantage that 99% Jews don't have. I was a camp director for 23 years. Jewish camping, not camps for Jews, but Jewish camp. You understand the content. That's how I met my wife. You know, we were idealists. Nobody paid us a lot of money, but we did it. Jewish camping, and the last one you know of is Ramah. I directed Alonim for 2 years, Herzl Camp for 8 years in the Midwest. The whole concept was joyous Judaism. See, don't make Judaism separate from playing baseball. See, if you play baseball in Hebrew, you don't have to go, or if you tell a maisel, a story, whatever, around a midnight campfire, I impact, and it's happy, and by the way, you can have a hot dog, kosher hot dog, while you're learning about the midrash that you tell about the campfire. So my philosophy was joyous Judaism.
L'chaim! L'chaim, l'chaim, to life. Life has a way of confusing us.
Blessing and bruising us.
Bring l'chaim to life. God would like us to be joyful, even when our hearts lie panting on the floor.
How much more can we be joyful when there's really something to be joyful for?
To life, l'chaim! To title my daughter,
My wife! It gives you something to think about.
something to drink about. Drink l'chaim to life!
Why don't we all give a round of applause for Rabbi Dershowitz?
I'd like to pass the mic right now to Professor Alan Dershowitz to, I believe he's had a few comments that he can share with us.
Well, thank you so much. I wish I could be there in person and help celebrate and give a big hug to my favorite relative and cousin, Tzvi. I just want to tell one brief story about how proud I am about my criminal grandfather. So let me tell you about my criminal grandfather. His name was Louis Dershowitz, and he was a very poor man, hardly made a living. But he found out that 20-something members of our family with a name a little bit different from ours, Dereshowitz, Dereshevitz, lived in Brno, Czechoslovakia. And they wrote to him asking if he could get them visas. And of course, it was impossible to get visas. There's going to be a new film now by Burns about the American inactivity in rescuing people from the Holocaust. But my grandfather was anything but inactive. And he decided to get affidavits for everybody. And he went around to everybody in Williamsburg and said, "Do you have a basement? Yeah, it's now a shul. You need a rabbi. You need a rebbitzin. You need a moil. You need somebody to take care of the mikvah. What mikvah? You got a mikvah." So my grandfather created false affidavits for all these folks, and they all had jobs, responsible jobs waiting for them, non-existent jobs waiting for them when they came to the country. And I was a little child when it happened, but I remember my family referred to them as the Czech Dershowitzes. And Wolf Dershowitz worked at the back of my father's store. Some of them lived in our homes for a while. And I think 27 of them were rescued on the eve of the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia, and most of the Jews in Brno, Czechoslovakia, didn't survive. So I just want to say how proud I am of my grandfather's willingness to engage in an act of civil disobedience to help save human beings, pikuach nefesh, which is the ultimate in Judaism, and also the rescuing of people who are being held captive. And the Tzvi Dershowitz branch of the family has done so much good for the world. Tzvi, of course, amazingly establishing one of the first Persian Jewish congregations, doing Jewish camping for so many years, being a rabbi to so many important people. When I go to Los Angeles, I'm always asked, "Oh, are you Tzvi's relative?" And everybody only has the highest praise for him. So Tzvi, till 120 and a few months. I don't ever wish 120 because nobody should die on their birthday. So 120 and 2 months. And everybody should read, if they're interested in the story, Tzvi, our relative, my uncle, Zachariah Dershowitz, Dershav, who's now 96 years old, has just written a book called The Dershowitz Family Saga, which tells the full story of how Rabbi Dershowitz and his whole family came to America on the eve of the Shoah. So Mazel Tov, and what a great family you have, and what a great honor to be included in honoring you on this occasion.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. I'm going to ask Rabbi Dershowitz actually has a role today. And before he gets up, I just want to let you guys know for the evening, Rabbi Dershowitz will give us the reading for today of the Akedah, and as I say, or more cutely as the people versus Abraham. And he'll give you some commentary behind it, and we'll go right into our program tonight. So once again, thank you, Professor Dershowitz. Thank you, Jimmy Taus. Thank you, Honorable Cole, for making tonight possible. And without further ado, let me ask Rabbi Dershowitz to come up here and start giving you guys the background of our trial today.
Thank you. I wanted to indicate I'm speechless. But if I was speechless, then I couldn't tell you what I wanted to tell you. I'm total surprised. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you, Alan, and everybody. I came to participate in a wonderful men's club event, and let's make it that way, okay? So I want to share with you the actual text from the Torah that will be under debate, the discussion. With a few excerpts to make it a little bit shorter. So this is from Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Hineni, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on the mountain which I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. He said to his servants, "Stay here." When he got there, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we'll come back to you." Well, Abraham carried the knife and the fire with him, and the 2 of them went together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father, "Abraham." He said, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here." Isaac said, "But where is the lamb and the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went out and together. So Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound up Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called unto him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Hineni, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me, your son, your only son. So my good people, we're going to have a debate. But think of it this way. We all know the role of parents when bringing up children is to be their role model. Teacher, anything from arithmetic to difficult math, to have fun. I mean, if the dad wants to, loves football, he'll take his kid to the football game also. The same with spiritual guide. To have faith and to express spirituality. Light Shabbat candles, fasting on Yom Kippur, celebrate Shabbat, coming to the synagogue, by the way, a hint. You know what Freud said? Freud said childhood experiences impact greatly on the way in which that child will live as an adult. So Abraham's era, you know about it. It was a token pagan world. Many deities. Invisible God, that was a foolish idea that you can't see God. You know, in Babylonia, there were many, many deities, many gods. As a matter of fact, the Midrash says Abraham's father was in business selling graven images of various gods, statues, and so on. And you know what? Abraham, his son, he's teaching his son. His son worked with him in the same store selling them. You see, the records show that one way to worship pagan deities is to make human sacrifice. Not go into it. It's all over in the literature. A husband sometimes offered his wife as a sacrifice, even a child, a son, as a human sacrifice to those deities, pagan gods. So when Abram, by the way, that was his name before it was Abraham, you know, we added the ham to the name. Okay, never mind. Then when Abram discovered God, it was unique. God to Abram said, you shall be a holy people. You know what the word holy means in Hebrew? Kodesh. Kodesh does not really mean holy. It means unique. It means different. God is holy, different. The Kohen is holy. And as a matter of fact, there's an example. You know how you say marriage in Hebrew? Kiddushin. You hear the word Kodesh, Kiddushin? It means that the man, the husband, is unique unto the wife. We say holy matrimony. And the wife unique and separate unto the husband. That's what holy means. So, Abram's faith in God was that he was holy, was different from the pagan gods. But you know, it takes time to learn about these things. It takes time to know everything about God. Don't you and I know it? I'm still trying to understand what God is all about. No way to learn about God in one moment. Every one of us knows it. So Abram knew, at least he thought he knew what God was. God wanted him to sacrifice his son. That's the way he was brought up, Isaac. Freud was right. Youthful experiences impact on the way in which people turn out to be as adults. In today's text, we're told that Abraham heard a voice of the angel. No, don't do it. In other words, Abram heard the voice of God, the one and only, the invisible God. God was Kodesh. He was different. He was unique. To me, That's the turning point of Abram's life. Now he knew what God was really all about. Was he guilty? Was he guilty of attempted murder? Does youthful upbringing justify a person's negative behavior as an adult just because you learned that as a kid? So let's call upon Judge Coley. Huh? You'll run the trial for us with extraordinary attorneys, by the way. Our own Sinai member, Jimmy Taus, and someone not a stranger to me, Alan, my cousin Alan Dershowitz, who incidentally celebrated his birthday just a few days ago. So happy birthday, and let's get on with the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi. And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you very much for responding to the summons to be here as a juror on this case. This is not the case of the decade. This is not the case of the century. This is the case of the millennia. This is the case. You have now heard all the facts. The rabbi has told you what is said about the Akedah. And the opportunity is for the lawyers to argue the case to you. Now, if this were a traditional trial, you'd be hearing from witnesses in person. But because the prosecution delayed somewhat in bringing this trial forward, it's impossible to bring Abraham or Isaac or either of the two servants forward to testify here today. So you have to rely on the facts that the rabbi gave you and apply the law that I'm about to give you. Let me give you a little overview of what you can expect tonight. Attorney Jimmy Taus is our prosecutor tonight. He and his office has charged Abraham. We mean no disrespect to not call him by his last name because we just don't know what it was. Has charged Abraham with the crime of attempted first-degree murder. The esteemed Professor Dershowitz is his defense attorney. He's going to try to prove to you why Abraham is not guilty of the crime of attempted murder. However, keep in mind, an individual is innocent until they're proven guilty. You've seen that in Law and Order about 1,000 times, so I don't need to explain the presumption of innocence to you. So the burden is on Attorney Taus over here to prove that the defendant is guilty of attempted murder. Your job is to render a verdict in this case. So it leads to the question, what is the definition of attempted murder? Attempted murder has two main elements. The first one is an intent to kill the person, in this case, an intention to kill Isaac. And the second one is an act in furtherance of that intent. So the issue can be anything that the defendant did. Now, we don't ever know what somebody is thinking. We don't have a video of what's going on in their mind. So in cases such as this, you have to evaluate the conduct of the defendant, or in other words, circumstantial evidence, to decide what the intent was, what Abraham's intent was when he went up to Moriah with Isaac. What is the act that you have to prove? It has to be more than mere preparation. It has to be something to further the intent to kill. It can really be any act whatsoever, beyond mere preparation. So somebody thinking that they want to kill somebody, that's not enough. Somebody even buying a gun to kill somebody may not be enough. But if somebody does something in advance of that, to advance the pursuit, then it's up to you to decide. And the way they describe it, in other words, the way the law describes it in California, is you have to decide, and let me use the exact phraseology because it's really good. It says, the direct action can be anything. It means that the murder would have occurred had an outside factor not interfered. The murder would have occurred had an outside factor not have occurred. This is a very deep and complex topic, as I learned today, more than just Googling, I'll have you know. And the way the process will be is that the prosecution is going to give an opening statement. The defense will give an opening statement. They've asked me to ask some questions, which, to be quite honest, is really a difficult task for me because these people really know the Talmud, I know the law, but I will do my best to try to challenge them and imagine what questions you might ask. Then they're going to give some closing arguments, and then you will have to render your verdict. And we'll ask each of you to pay attention to everything, turn your cell phones off. If I had a bailiff, they would be very firm with you by leaving a cell phone on, and we'll proceed. Mr. Taus, would you please give your opening statement?
Your Honor, distinguished members of the jury, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. This is an idea and theme we will come back to again and again tonight. For today we find ourselves in the unique and unenviable position. We've been convened to sit in judgment of the case titled The People versus Abraham. We convene to seek justice for the criminal conduct of Abraham, our own ancestor, a man, an icon, the progenitor of three great theologies, the first believer in the OG, and I mean the one God. This is an individual who many of us consider a role model and look up to. And yes, I said many of us, as I include myself amongst those who look up to Abraham and want to see only the best in him. But today, we have a sacred duty to judge honestly and fairly, to put aside our hero worship and pursue justice. We are here to look at the facts, look at the law, and in the most Jewish of traditions, pursue and find justice in this criminal court. It is important that we remember we are here to serve in a criminal court. I go back to tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. This quote comes from Shoftim, Judges, which is the portion we read this past Saturday. The portion is dedicated to the establishment of man-made courts with men, not God, not angels, but men sitting in judgment of each other. And including in that judgment is for criminal conduct. But why does it say tzedek, tzedek, tirdof? Why is the word tzedek repeated twice? Because fundamental to our religious theology, as well as to our democratic ideology as detailed by our Constitution and by the Supreme Court, there exists a fundamental separation between church and state, and that applies to the courts as well. Why tzedek twice? Because there is this distinction between God's justice and man's justice. Because there are a set of rules by which God judges and a different set of rules that mankind uses to judge. Not only is this separation supported by our secular laws, by the halachic principle of dina de malchutka dina, or in English, the law of the land is the law. You heard me say earlier that this is a criminal court, and it is important to keep that in mind as you decide this matter, because we are not here to judge Abraham in the eyes of God, but in the eyes of the secular criminal courts. But wait, you might say, isn't there this thing, double jeopardy, I've heard of, that you can't be charged twice for the same actions? Well, to the contrary, the Supreme Court has recognized the doctrine of dual sovereignty. That is to say that there are two separate sovereigns, one being the states and one being the federal courts. Similarly, there's a dual sovereignty here, one being God's laws and God's justice, and the other being man's laws and man's justice. In fact, in a few weeks from now, we make a separate and special reading of the facts contained in the indictment, and we'll read them on Rosh Hashanah as a reminder that God sits in judgment separate from man's courts. We read it during the year to remind us but on Rosh Hashanah, it's God's justice. Now, this is not to say that Abraham's faith is not important. It is important. It's crucial. It provides us with Abraham's motive. It helps demonstrate Abraham's intent to murder his son Isaac. Thankfully, the tragic act is thwarted by the intervention of God's angel at the very last moment, but not by Abraham's own volition. It's God's angel that intervenes. This brings us to the facts you heard Rabbi Dershowitz state and how they apply to criminal statutes we use to pursue justice in our court. Judge Court will give you additional instructions at the end, and you heard her give some to beginning. But in broad terms, attempted murder is the failed or aborted attempt to murder another person. This means that the state must prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Abraham intended to murder his son Isaac. And absent the intervention of God's angel at that last moment, Abraham would have in fact tried to kill Isaac. And the facts will do just that. They will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Abraham not just planned, but took affirmative steps to carry out the shechting, the slaughter of his son Isaac. These are the undisputed facts. First, God decides to put Abraham to a test. Now, as with many celebrity trials, there's been no shortage of pundits who've opined on the case. But when the pundits talk about it, they go straight from God's decision to put Abraham to the test to describing the task before Abraham. But in doing so, they skipped an important fact and part of the test. The text is clear. It says, quote, God puts Abraham to the test, saying to him, Abraham. And Abraham answers, here I am, end quote. Abraham is quick to respond, eager to hear God's will, eager to do God's will. Then God tells Abraham of the task. He says, take your son, your only son, the one you love, and bring him to Mount Moriah as a sacrifice. Now I want to take a quick minute to discuss this idea of Abraham's only son. We all know that prior to Isaac being born, Abraham has a son with a handmaiden Hagar. And that son is Ishmael, Abraham's actual firstborn son, who at the behest of God is cast out into the desert with nothing more than a satchel of water and a little bread for he and his mother to share. While Ishmael doesn't die, Abraham clearly demonstrates the same willingness to lose his child if it's God's instruction and will to do so. As a matter of fact, the incident with Ishmael immediately precedes the present incident with Isaac, the tale of Ishmael coming in Genesis 21 and Isaac in Genesis 22. But going back to Isaac, after God tells Abraham to sacrifice his only son, without a word of question or hesitation, Abraham wakes in the morning, but not just in the morning, early in the morning, again showing his eagerness to do God's will. Without a word of protest, Abraham saddles the donkey, gets two of his young assistants, splits the wood for the burnt offering, and heads off to the place God instructed him to go. They travel this way for 3 days without any indication that Abraham told Sarah, his wife, the mother of Isaac, or even Isaac himself, where they were going, and more importantly, why they were going there. After 3 days, Abraham can see the destination, Mount Moriah. He tells the two servants to remain with the donkey while he takes Isaac. He puts the wood for the offering on Isaac's back, but he keeps for himself the fire stone and the knife, the two implements needed to execute Isaac. Then, in this test of faith to God, Abraham demonstrates a lack of faith in his son Isaac, or Isaac's faith. Isaac asks his father, where is the sacrifice to God? And rather than tell Isaac the truth, he lies to him. He says, God will provide the lamb. Now, it's an odd statement to begin with, that God will provide the lamb for the sacrifice. It's not much of a sacrifice if it's something that somebody else is giving you to get rid of. A sacrifice comes from your own place. He tells Isaac, we'll go up on the mountain, we'll find what we find, and we'll sacrifice that. And Isaac, being the dutiful son, goes with him without question. Then when they get to the top of the mountain, Abraham demonstrates his continued lack of faith in his son. Abraham binds Isaac. He ties him up. Now I want you to think about that for a second. He ties him up. Why? To make sure that he can't escape. He then lays him on top of the wood, which is on top of the altar that Abraham himself built. And he's going to need these in order to carry out God's task and kill his son. He needs to make sure that Isaac can't flee, but this is an elaborate gimmick for a man who doesn't intend to do anything to that boy. And now comes the key evidence, the key statement of fact. And Abraham picked up the knife to slaughter his son. I'm going to say that again. This is a quote. And Abraham picked up the knife to slaughter his son. End quote. The statement of intent is unequivocal. And Abraham picks up the knife to slaughter his son. There's no indication of hesitation, no indication of deception or intent to do anything with the knife but to kill Isaac. At that moment, when Abraham is clearly past the planning stages and has taken the affirmative step of grabbing the knife to kill Isaac, all doubt is gone as to what Abraham's intent is and what he intends to do. He intends to kill Isaac. It doesn't say he picks up the knife to inspect it. It doesn't say he picks up the knife used for ritual slaughters. It doesn't even say he picks up the knife without a modifier. It's very clear. He picks up the knife to slay Isaac. There's no room for interpretation, no room for excuse, no room for doubt. If not for the angel calling out in urgency, Abraham, Abraham, Abraham would have carried out the murder of his son. The intervention of the angel may have saved Abraham from the murder charge, but it does not absolve him of the clear and unambiguous attempted murder of his son Isaac. Abraham's response to the angel is the same as it was when God first called to him, a quick and eager, "Here I am." Abraham was eager to hear the voice of the angel stopping him before he completed the dreadful task. There's no question that Abraham loved his son, but his faith drove him to kill his son Isaac. The attempt to kill Isaac is confirmed by the one independent eyewitness to the act, the angel himself. Abraham will be blessed, quote, and the angel says, "Because you have done this thing and you did not withhold your only son, your only one." There's no question that the angel knows and understands that Abraham was about to kill his son had he not intervened. But there's even more evidence of Abraham's intent and guilt. Abraham's response to hearing about his reward. Quote, "Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba." Abraham doesn't celebrate. He doesn't take any pride in his actions. And he returns with his servants. Now, it's important here. It says he returned to his servant, but he returns alone. He doesn't return with Isaac, the intended victim. In fact, he will never see his son Isaac again, not until Isaac comes to bury him. But there's more to the passage, because it says he went to Beersheba, but that's not where his wife Sarah, the mother of Isaac, was. And in fact, he never sees Sarah again either. Now, Abraham does not return home to the mother of the victim knowing what he had done, knowing what all of you know he had done. Ladies and gentlemen, Abraham flees in guilt, and I use that term guilt in both manners, with a guilty conscience, to the desert of Beersheba to hide. And eventually that guilt leads him to try to reconcile with Ishmael, the other son he estranged at God's will. The facts are undisputed, and they lead to only one possible conclusion, that Abraham, as much as it may pain us to state, is guilty of the attempted murder of his son Isaac.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taus. I think that was a very compelling argument, and this is exactly what a good lawyer should do. But remember, you have to keep an open mind. And now you'll hear from Professor Dershowitz.
Thank you so much. May it please the court. The prosecution has presented an absolutely brilliant and compelling case as prosecutors often do, but it's a one-sided case. He has presented the case from the point of view of God. Not surprising, when prosecutors bring a grand jury, they only bring in evidence against the defendant. The defendant generally doesn't testify. Now you will hear the defendant's point of view. What was Abraham thinking? The Bible doesn't tell us. The story is told from God's point of view. After all, who wrote the Bible? God wrote the Bible. Abraham did not intend to kill Isaac. Abraham may have been tested by God, but in turn, he was testing God. He was seeking to determine whether God, to use Rabbi Dershowitz's terms, was kadosh, was unique, or was he like all the other gods who would actually allow a man to kill his own son? That's what was going on. Abraham wanted to see if God was kadosh, whether God was in fact unique. And this is not the first time Abraham tested God. When God came down to him and said, I am about to kill the sinners of Sodom, Abraham challenged God. He said to him, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo na'aseh mishpat." Will the judge of all the world not do justice? Chalila lacha. God forbid. Imagine challenging God. But that was Abraham's way. So he challenged God, and God passed the first test. He said, all right, if there are 10 righteous people, I won't kill them. So then there was another test. The second test, mentioned by our distinguished prosecutor, was Ishmael being sent out into the wilderness. And Abraham had to wonder, is God going to allow this innocent boy to die? Will God fail the test? Will he not be kadosh? Will I have to go and get another God? I've already rejected my father's gods. Now I'm thinking about this God. He seems good. He passed the test. Look, he failed an earlier test. He killed many Jew people in the flood of Noah's time, but then he passed the test of Sodom. And let's see if he passes the test of Ishmael. And he does. He gives to Ishmael's mother water, and Ishmael gets saved. So Abraham now understands that he can test God, and God seems to have passed at least 2 out of 3 tests. So what happens here? God says, bring your son, your only son, the one you love, as an offering. He doesn't say kill him. He says, offer him up to me. And Abraham says, all right, I'll offer him up, but I'm not going to kill him. If God doesn't intervene, yeah, I'll hold the knife above him. But if God doesn't intervene, I'm going to drop the knife. I'm not going to allow that to happen, because that will mean God has failed the third test. And I'm going to go looking for another God. Now, God's not going to write that story. When God writes his narrative, it's from the point of view of God. But from Abraham's point of view, he was testing God. And God sent the messenger. And God, through the messenger, passed the test. Now, Abraham, if he really intended to kill Isaac, wouldn't have listened to the messenger. After all, he's just a messenger. He's just an angel. God had directly instructed him to offer him up. And if Abraham was going to do that, he wouldn't allow a mere angel to interfere. But he took the first excuse he could and said, all right, now he's passed the test. By the way, that wasn't the first point. He delayed. It isn't a 3-day trip to get to Mount Moriah. He took 3 days to get there, and he slowly went up, and he bound him, and he tied him. He wasn't sure when God would back away from his testing of Abraham. So what we have here is mutual testing. What we have here is God testing Abraham, but Abraham is testing God at the same time. Now, I think the question you can ask is who passed the test and who failed the test. I mean, it's possible to say that everybody passed the test. God didn't allow him to kill in the end. Abraham indicated a willingness to go up to the very last point, but he wouldn't have gone beyond that last point. And to prove attempted murder under the law of California and under the law of the Bible, you have to prove an unequivocal, specific intent to kill. But for the intervention of the angel, he would have stabbed Isaac to death. I submit to you that when you look at the prior tests that Abraham gave to God, you have to look at this as yet another test. Let me cite a precedent. Some years ago, a Jewish man in Tennessee called me and asked me to represent him on appeal. He was charged with attempted murder. What happened is his sister had been burned to death by her former boyfriend. And my client wanted the killer, who he believed was the killer, but the police hadn't charged him, to confess. So he went to the house and he took a knife and he was holding it above the breast of the man who he was charged with attempting to kill. And the police came in and he dropped the knife. And I presented what I call the Abraham defense. And we prevailed in the case. It was not clear beyond a doubt that my client would have actually plunged the knife. Maybe he was just holding the knife over him to threaten him, to get him to confess. If he had stabbed him in the chest, he never would have gotten the confession. And since there was a reasonable doubt, my client won. And so the Abraham defense has prevailed in civil courts. Now, I agree with my distinguished opponent that we have to separate God's law from human law. Only God knows whether or not there was a test or there wasn't a test. Only Abraham, and neither of them are going to testify at this trial, know that. So there is a very significant doubt about what would have happened had the angel not intervened. And I think, as was said by both the judge and my distinguished opponent, you have to look at the circumstantial evidence, because we're not going to get direct X-ray evidence of intent. And the circumstantial evidence shows that Abraham was testing God, that Abraham was not yet completely committed to the claim that this God was kadosh, that this God was unique, that this God was different from the other gods. And I think the best proof of that is if God hadn't intervened, if Abraham had in fact killed Isaac, we wouldn't be here today. None of us would be Jews. None of us would be part of a religion which, like Moloch and the others back in the day, had gods ordering people to kill their children. So the only way for Judaism to thrive and survive, the only way for God's prophecy that Abraham will be the patriarch of a very large number of people as big as the stars, was to be absolutely certain that the death did not occur. So this was a mutual test, a difficult mutual test. Elie Wiesel puts it brilliantly when he says, this was really a message to the Jewish people that being a Jew doesn't give you absolute certainty of survival, that it will pose challenges over and over again. And sometimes God will intervene, sometimes God will not intervene, sometimes human beings will stop what they're doing, sometimes they won't. And when you have that kind of uncertainty, when you have that kind of doubt as to what would have happened, should have happened, could have happened, that's all speculative. And the speculation is not nearly enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt of attempted murder. Attempted murder requires that you know for an absolute certainty the mind of Abraham. And the mind of Abraham is unknowable based on what he did or what he said at the moment of the Akedah, but it is knowable based on what he did and what he said previously. Abraham knew that God would not allow him to kill Isaac because he didn't allow Ishmael to die. He didn't allow innocent people like Lot to die in Sodom. He didn't have the other tests that were passed. God passed the previous tests, and Abraham had full confidence that God would pass this test. And I ask you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, character evidence is very important, and we judge people on the totality of their lives and their character. And I ask you to ask yourselves, knowing Abraham's life, knowing all the wonderful things that he did, do you believe beyond any doubt that Abraham actually would have plunged that knife into the heart of his son, his only son? Now, how do I explain the fact that he walked away and that he didn't go back to his wife? Well, his faith made him do things to his son that he wished he hadn't done. If Abraham were charged with child abuse, I wouldn't be here making this argument. Abraham did subject his son to psychological trauma. I would love to have been a fly on the wall of the walk back from, as the rabbi said earlier, from the mountain back to the servants. Isaac says, "You were going to do what to me?" And Abraham had to explain. And that certainly makes understandable the fact that Isaac doesn't speak very much for the rest of the Torah until his deathbed, when his son tricks him into his birthright. He's a damaged person. Abraham passed the test, and God passed the test. But Abraham didn't pass it without some trauma or difficulty to the child. And that's, again, the message that Elie Wiesel sends. It's not easy to be a Jew. My grandmother would have put it in Yiddish. It's not easy to be a Jew. And what God was saying to Abraham, look, I'm confident that you're probably not going to do this. You will withhold your hand. But you didn't simply tell me when I said, bring your son up to the mountain. You said, Hineni. You didn't say, buzz off. I'm not having you as my God. Asking me to offer my son? No, I'm not going to do that. He didn't do that. He took the son. He traumatized the son. But in the end, he couldn't do what he thought God might have asked him to do. But he was testing God, because in the end, he was convinced that God would do with Isaac what God did with Ishmael, that God would do with Isaac what he did to Lot and the innocent people of Sodom. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have to have a reasonable doubt about Abraham's intention to kill Isaac. I ask you, therefore, to acquit.
And a most passionate plea on behalf of Abraham. Mr. Taus, please take your podium. Professor Dershowitz raised a very interesting point. He said, and Professor, hopefully I don't get this wrong, he said something to the effect of, in the Bible, which is written by God, you only hear God's perspective. In a sense, he's saying that God was an imperfect narrator of the event, and therefore you couldn't possibly know what it is that Abraham was thinking. How do you respond to that?
Several responses. The first one is that on every Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, as the Bible is taken out of the ark behind you, we say, Zot HaTorah asher asah Moshe al pi Adonai biyad Moshe, which means from the mouth of God, but they had a court reporter, Moses. Moses wrote it down. So it's not just God's one-sided word, but it is the descendants of Abraham eventually who also acknowledge that. But I want to talk about this idea of the God shopping that Professor Dershowitz alludes to. First of all, this idea of a test, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16, God makes clear, quote, you shall not try, you shall not test the Lord as you tested him in Massah. Abraham already subscribed to this. We're asking whether or not Abraham was following through or still God shopping. The covenant, the contract, the legally binding agreement between God and Abraham had already taken place. And if there's any doubt as to whether or not Abraham was serious that he was going to follow through on his end of the contract, at the age of 99, Abraham takes a knife once again, but this time circumcises himself. At the age of 99, that's not a man still shopping for a God. That's a man who's very well committed, as I'm sure at least the male members of the jury would agree to. That's not somebody who's still looking to find an answer, looking to test the God.
All right, thank you very much. Professor Dershowitz, we have a question for you.
Sure.
Even though you doubt that the perspective in the Bible is the correct perspective because it was written by God, and therefore we don't know what Abraham said, it is very clear from what Rabbi Dershowitz told us that the test was the 10th test that was given by God for Abraham. And it was a test of his faithfulness. If it is as you say, that Abraham had absolutely no intent to slay Isaac, that he would never have done it under any circumstances, how would that then be a test of faithfulness? What I'm saying is that if Abraham did not intend to follow through, how could that possibly be that Abraham then passed the test of faithfulness? And in fact, God finds that he did pass the test of faithfulness and then guaranteed that Isaac and his progeny would go on forever.
It's an excellent question, and Kierkegaard poses that question in his essay on the Akedah about faith. He talks about two different kinds of faith: empirical faith and moral faith. Empirical faith is illustrated by what we all know of the game that people play. You trust your loved one so much that you're willing to fall backwards, and you're sure that your loved one will catch you. And if your loved one doesn't catch you, you're going to get hurt. That's empirical faith. That's something you believe is going to happen based on your faith. It's a kind of faith. The other kind of faith is moral faith. That is, that you believe that what God tells you to do, no matter how horrendous it might be, is morally justified. And the Bible, unlike Kierkegaard, doesn't distinguish. It just says faith. And the faith, I believe, was an empirical faith. That is, that Abraham knew full well that God would not let him down, as he didn't let down Ishmael, as he didn't let down the innocent people of Sodom. And as far as the argument goes that Moses was the court reporters have to take down every single word. They're not allowed to substitute words. So every word of the Torah, al pi Hashem, out of the mouth of God. So you can't attribute to Moses, but even if you could, let's remember that Abraham is not the only person to challenge God. Moses challenged him. Moses said to him, if you don't forgive the people of Israel, erase me from your book. The faith in God is constantly tested. Again, to quote my dear friend, the late Elie Wiesel lost his faith in God after the Shoah, and it took him years to regain it. And so no matter how religious you are, no matter how Jewish you are, and if I ever got a group of rabbis, really smart rabbis, in a lie detector room, I will bet you most of them at some point in their lives, at some point, questioned their faith. And so the issue is not fundamentalist faith, not being just unquestioned faith. Obviously, Abraham didn't have that. If he had that, he wouldn't have said to God, Chalila Lacha. How do you say Chalila Lacha to a man? If I ever said Chalila to my grandmother, she'd slap me on the face. Chalila Lacha really means it would be unkosher of you. It would be immoral of you. And yet Abraham is talking to God that way. That is not a fundamentalist. Abraham was not a fundamentalist. He had to think hard about the difference between moral faith and empirical faith. And in the end, he had empirical faith, but not moral faith. He would not have killed. He would not have ended up believing that this is a God like Moloch, a God like all the other gods, who absolutely demands that I kill my son, my only son, the one that I love. So he had empirical faith, but he did not have, he questioned the moral faith.
Thank you. Mr. Taus, So what Professor Dershowitz is saying, in a sense, is that there's two different kinds of faith. There's empirical and there's moral faith. In a sense, it seems like he's almost saying, like there's a certain set of laws for somebody like Abraham, who, although moral, was clearly a hotshot. I mean, he is the founder of Judeo-Christianity. He's the original Sadiq. He's the father of our religion. Isn't there a different standard? How can you apply California law in 2022 to the conduct of a man who performed this act many, many millennia ago?
Thank you, Your Honor. The simple answer to the question is within the question, and it's because God tells us to. God tells us that we should have this dichotomy with it. As I mentioned, the tzedek, the repetition of the word twice. But there's another concept that God teaches us, that there's two different types of commandments that he makes within the Torah. There's the ones known as ben adam lamakom, and the other ones that are known as ben adam lachavara, the distinction being the commandments between man and God. And there's a whole nother set of commandments between man and man. And that's what we're here today to judge. The commandments between man and man, you can have disparate outcomes with the law that God applies and the morals that he's teaching, and the ones that we set up between ourselves. Because God tells us in Shoftim, in the portion we just read this past Saturday, set up your courts, set up your judges, don't take bribes, make sure it's an honest court. These things are set up for us because God wants us to sit amongst ourselves and judge. What happens when we die, what God judges, what God decides, that's in his realm. But in this court, Your Honor, you are Your Honor, and they are the triers of fact. God is not sitting in the jury box. Other men, women, peers, Abraham's own descendants sit in judgment, because that's the way it should be. It's not a question of, as Professor Dershowitz said, whether or not you question your faith. I'm sure it is true what he said. Every rabbi, from the most holy there is to regardless of denomination, I'm sure has had a moment in time where they've questioned faith. It's not whether or not you question your faith. It's what you do when you have that question. Here, Abraham demonstrates clearly through his actions and through his shame afterwards that his faith told him he must do what God said. And I want to address what Professor Dershowitz said about Sdom, because it's a very different set of facts. In the story of Sdom, Abraham hears that God intends to lay waste to Sdom. There's no test for Abraham there. God doesn't tell Abraham, I want you to go to Sdom and wipe them out. There's no commandment, there's no instruction, there's no test of faith. So Abraham chimes in and says, wait a second, maybe we can do something here. Maybe we can negotiate this down. If I find 100 righteous men, 10 righteous men. And he negotiates with God. But he doesn't do that here. He makes no attempt, there's no indication at any time that he questions the instructions here. Professor Dershowitz mentioned Moses' advocacy. It's the same thing. Moses isn't instructed to punish the people. God tells Moses he's going to do it, and Moses advocates. It's a separation of the areas of law and a different determination of faith. And for what we're here to decide, his faith violated man's law.
Well, just a quick follow-up question, then I'll have one last question for Professor Dershowitz. So you said in your opening statement that Abraham said to, let me get your direct quote here. You said that when Abraham said to Isaac, God will provide the lamb, you said that Abraham was lying. However, if Abraham knew that God would provide an animal for sacrifice, isn't that evidence that he had no intent to kill Isaac? Isn't that exactly what Professor Dershowitz is saying?
No, because when Abraham, first of all, Abraham is not prophetic in that manner, because first of all, Abraham says to Isaac, God will provide a lamb, And in fact, when there is an animal, it happens to be a ram, not a lamb. There's a different animal. So it's not like he has this prophecy and he knows exactly what's going to happen. But beyond that, there's the question of whether or not when Abraham gets to the top of the mountain with Isaac, it goes through the progression of what he does. He builds the altar, he puts the wood on the altar, he binds Isaac, he puts Isaac on the altar. You know what's missing from that progression? He looks for a ram, he looks for a lamb, he looks for some other sacrifice. He didn't need to look for another sacrifice, he had brought it with him. He was intending to kill Isaac. Had he been looking for another animal, he would have done so. But this was a test of Abraham's faith. And frankly, to question that faith is to question why Abraham, as somebody mentioned earlier, his name was Avram. He changed it to Avraham, adding the H for the symbolism of God. God is fundamental to who Abraham is and in his following. And merely because he's following the actions of God does not get him off the hook for what God told him to do. He's still responsible for his own actions. And there's no indication anywhere other than from very clever argument by counsel that in fact was the intent, that he knew there was going to be another animal there. He also tells the servants and Isaac that we're going to go there, we're going to pray. He actually doesn't say that we're going to do the sacrifice. They actually say we'll worship and then we'll return. Well, they didn't worship and he didn't return with Isaac. So the statements that he even made to the servants are also not true.
All right. Well, I think that one is very brave to call Abraham a liar, and so I commend you for that. Professor, here's the last question I'll ask tonight. There's been a lot of discussion about faith and faithfulness, and it's unquestionable, regardless of whose perspective you're looking at, that this was a test that God was giving to Abraham, and he passed because he was faithful. How can we not condemn Abraham when, if there is somebody else who steadfastly believes in their religion and believes that God is talking to them when they strap a bomb to their chest and explode themselves with a lot of other people in a crowded bus? Isn't that also an act of faithfulness? How can we judge that any differently?
That's a great question. And we do and should condemn people who kill others on the basis of faith. The question is not whether we are going to condemn or praise Abraham. Abraham can be praised for a lot of things. The question is whether he's guilty of attempted murder. And he could still be unpraiseworthy. And I think I said that. I conceded it in my opening argument. He was unpraiseworthy for causing psychological damage, maybe for lying. But if I were a lawyer, I'd object to introducing other crimes evidence, lies and other character deficiencies on the part of Abraham. But the one thing he couldn't bring himself to do in the end, and he wouldn't bring himself to do in the end, was to kill. So Abraham expressed great faith, but the faith was empirical faith. And that may be the strongest faith there is. I have so much faith in God. I have so much faith that he is Tzedek, that he is Kodesh. I have so much faith in the goodness and the greatness of God that I know he could never, ever ask me to go through with this act. He's testing me. He's testing me. And I'm prepared to accept the test up to a certain point. Yeah, I will lie to my servants. Yeah, I will impose psychological trauma. Yeah, I will say lamb when it's really a ram. I will do those things. But ultimately, I do not believe God would ever test me based on my willingness to kill my son, my only son, the one that I love, particularly because at the time of Abraham's actions, there was no Olam Haba. There was no notion that there was a world to come, that he would be reunited with Isaac at some point. This was the end. This was the termination of a human life. It would have been the most selfish act in the world. After all, he did have not only a child before, but 5 children afterward. For Sarah, it was her only child, her beloved child, and Sarah suffered greatly after learning that Abraham came even close to doing that without seeking her consent, to test God by going up to the mountain. So I think we have a lot of commonality here. Nobody is praising people for causing damage based on faith, based on moral faith. But in the end, it's the empirical faith that matters. And the empirical faith is what kept Abraham. Now, there are those in the Bible who have interpreted, commentators, who have interpreted the angel. After all, God didn't come down and tell him not to do it. God had told him to offer. He didn't tell him to withdraw the offer. He sent only a messenger to do it. And the question is, was it really a messenger? Or was it Abraham's conscience? Was it his unwillingness to carry through the act? Was it the angel in him? As Madison put it, the better angels of humankind. He wasn't referring to some external ghost. He was referring to something that human beings have the capacity to do, and that is to have conflicting obligations, moral faith obligations, empirical faith obligations, and ultimately to resolve them by their better angels. And that's what Abraham did.
Thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we don't really have time if they're going to give it to us in writing. Okay, so I know that you all have questions, and truthfully, as unqualified as I am to ask questions, I too had more questions. I'm sorry. I understand that several of you want to ask questions, and I too, as unqualified as I am to ask questions, still had more questions. But at this time, it's important if we want to end on time, and I believe we do. Is that right, Michael? We want to end on time?
I think we can take a few questions if we lead over a little.
Sure. Okay, we'll take a few short questions. They have to be very pithy. And I'm asking our participants, our lawyers, to respond in an equally pithy manner. Please stand up and tell us what your question is.
I believe the test is not merely on Abraham. Abraham just purely followed God's order. And he knew, already spoken with his angels, and he knew he had a clear communication with him. So it is not Abraham on trial, it's rather the commitment and the faith of Isaac. Isaac was a 35-year-old man. He wasn't a kid. He could have fought his father and run away. Instead, he showed faith in God.
Thank you. Is there a question that you wanted to ask? A comment. Well, thank you very much. That's a very learned comment. Anybody have a specific question? Okay, gentleman in the blue jacket. Sorry. Well, wait, I need questions. Let me get to somebody who actually has a question here. Madam, what is your question?
Because they were sacrificing sons to, I'm sorry, I said that it was not a unique, for sure Abraham knew that it wasn't a unique thing to sacrifice a son. They were sacrificed children to Baal and Ashtoreth. So as he argued with God in the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, why did he argue with him about this? It wasn't a big deal to sacrifice a son.
Fair enough. Okay. Are there any actual questions here? These are all great comments, and they really are very important. But I think we're just going to questions to counsel because there's going to be a time after this where we can all discuss these matters, and we can all express our opinions at that time. Sir?
I do have a question. If we consider God all-knowing, how can God not know that Abraham was testing him when he was holding the knife?
Fair enough. That's a good question. Professor Dershowitz, I think that one is addressed to you.
The answer is in the text. The angel says to Abraham, or says generally, now we know. Now we know. He uses the word now. You have not withheld your son. It's not. So he used the word now, and obviously, using the word now makes it clear that God wasn't absolutely certain, and he wasn't certain what kind of faith he would have. But now we know that he had faith to make an offering, but also faith to know that God would never go through with requiring to kill his son. But now we know, the conflict between free will, all-knowing, has plagued humankind from the beginning. And I don't think the human brain is capable of answering the question how we can have free will and still have God know everything we're going to do. And I think particularly the book of Genesis has a God who was a learning God, not a God who knows everything, a God who's made mistakes. He regretted having the flood. He admitted that he was wrong about Saddam. And so I think we have a God who's learning and who along with people, it's like a great seminar in a law school or a college. When I used to teach courses, for me, the best test was how much I learned that day from my students. And I taught my students and I learned from them. And I think the Akeda's brilliance and the Saddam story's brilliance are each of the participants learns from each other. Nobody is all-knowing. There were doubts. Just one more point, and I'll stop. And that is the other lesson to be learned is, remember, this is not the only time in history that people were asked to sacrifice their children. During the Crusades, many Jews sacrificed their children in order not to have them be baptized and converted. During the Holocaust, we know of stories, 20-something women who killed themselves rather than serve as prostitutes for the Reich. So the idea of Judaism demanding sacrifices, but demanding them only for good reasons, not as tests, I think is pervasive in Judaism and a very important lesson. So one of the other lessons is God may ask you to make a sacrifice. As a parent once told me in Israel, every time a child in Israel, a boy or a girl, turns 18, that parent has the voice of God. Bring your son, bring your daughter, the one you love, bring him up to an offering to Jerusalem, offer him to the IDF. Maybe he'll live, maybe she'll live, maybe she won't. But Israel has been based on the idea of offering a sacrifice in your own children. And so these lessons are as important today as they were 3,000 years ago.
Thank you very much. That was a great question.
Briefly, and
well,
I will
let's
be
get
brief.
one more question, and then I'd actually
like to address that specific one, if I may.
Okay, go ahead.
So, first of all, with the idea that he brought up at the end about the Holocaust and the soldiers of Israel and the sacrifice. First of all, none of the parents who send their kids to the army are doing so as a sacrifice of their child intentionally. They're doing so to save lives, not to take them. That's a fundamental difference between the soldiers in the IDF and most of the ones that they oppose. I also want to talk about the Holocaust that he mentioned, because it's an interesting thing that he raised up, because as they walked into the gas chambers, the Jews were known to have been singing Anima Amin, Anima Amin be'emuna shlema. I believe, I have faith in the wholeness and the sanctity of God. It's the very same test that Abraham is put through, and the Jews of the Holocaust fought and survived, and we're here today, and so did they. Now, as far as the test itself, this test, as any teacher, at least any good teacher will tell you, when you give a child a test, you're not doing it to provide them with a task or a hurdle they have to overcome. The purpose of a test you give a child is to instill in them the ideas that they've learned, confidence, knowledge in what they've been taught, knowledge that what they've been taught is valid and that they have absorbed and adopted that lesson. It's not merely a task to set them to. It's a learning moment for that child, as it was for Abraham. Nobody is saying it wasn't a learning moment for Abraham, but it wasn't a test of God. The angel doesn't come down and say, when Professor Joshowitz is talking about the inner angels within Abraham, because this angel actually also says, and you will be rewarded. That's some inner monologue he's having that not only does it tell him don't do it, but it tells him the rewards he's going to achieve afterwards. And the angel, if this is a test of God, the angel doesn't say, hey, God, good job, here's your reward. The angel tells Abraham his reward because it's Abraham's test. This isn't Abraham testing God. This is God testing Abraham, and it's clear by the outcome, by who obtains reward, by who gets a grade.
I mean, as we can see by the comments from everybody, that this is a very deep topic, and we have a lot of frustrated lawyers in here who wanted to express their opinion, and I respect that. We do have one frustrated lawyer who actually I'm married to, so I'm going to let him have the last question tonight.
Either one of you, assuming that Abraham operated on a spiritual plane far above us, far, far, far above us, something that we could never even comprehend, and you hear that people are entitled to be judged by a jury of their peers, are we really peers of Abraham where we can judge him?
Okay, let's get a two-sentence response from Professor Dershowitz. 2 sentences.
Well, I think in a civil court, we do have to sit in judgment over people's actions. And I agree with what all of you have said. It's no defense for somebody to say, God made me do it. No, it's no defense to say I'll get 72 virgins in heaven. That's no defense. And I would not put forward that defense. The defense I put forward is very different. It's the empirical faith defense, the faith that Abraham had that God would not carry that forward. Now, why isn't that fully laid out in the text? Because God wrote the text. So, of course, God is going to have his angel say, all right, you'll be rewarded. He's not talking about it from the perspective of how Abraham sees this. He's talking about it from the perspective of a prosecution witness that appeared before the grand jury. Tonight, you've heard my defendant's point of view. That was not heard in the Bible, but you've heard it now, and you have to consider it in deciding whether or not there's a reasonable doubt about his intent.
Okay, well, that's akin to a closing argument. So, Jimmy, Mr. Taus, why don't I let you make your closing argument? You can use your few minutes however you choose.
I will start briefly in a direct answer to the question. Yes, this is his peers. Every courthouse you'll go to across the nation has some words of wisdom on the outside of that courthouse talking about how they define justice. On this building, right behind this wall behind me, you'll see the words Lador Vador, from generation to generation. We, you, the jury, are the descendants of Abraham. You're his kin. You can't get much more of a jury of your peers than one's own offspring and their children. And that's part of the lesson, the faith that was being tested with Abraham. Would he still follow through? As Rabbi Dershowitz said in his opening remarks, what we do teaches our children. So yes, this is the lesson you are being asked, did you learn? Did God teach you? Did Abraham teach you? And you, and only you, frankly, have the right to sit in judgment. Now, I said it at the beginning, and I'll say it again now, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. So how do we follow this principle of finding justice? How can we pursue justice here today? By following the law. By recognizing that while I stand here today as the prosecutor in this criminal trial, I'm actually Abraham's defense counsel. I'm the one defending Abraham's honor, Abraham's integrity, Abraham's faith. It's a good thing he's being tried in absentia, because I shudder to think, ask yourselves, what would Abraham himself think of the arguments being proffered by his counsel? Ironically, although my esteemed colleague Professor Dershowitz is a distinguished defense attorney, in arguing that Abraham would not have followed through and followed God's commandment, he is actually the prosecutor. He's prosecuting Abraham's faith. He's prosecuting the essence of who Abraham was and what he stood for, and prosecuting the sacrifice that both he and Isaac made. As stated earlier, the case is titled The People versus Abraham. But that isn't the full name because it leaves out his alias, his given name. As we talked about earlier, his given name is Avram. He changes it to Avraham, adding the reference to God, because so fundamental to Abraham is his faith and his belief in God that he makes it part of his name, part of who he is. I also want to briefly go back through the facts and ask you to think about two questions as I do. First, I want you to think about the facts and the text and ask yourself, is there evidence, and I won't make Professor Dershowitz say it, I'll say it, is there evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that Abraham intended to kill his son Isaac? Now, whether you support the reason or not isn't the question. You can agree with him, you can find it an act of martyrdom and selflessness, or you can find it deplorable, but it doesn't matter in our civil court, in our criminal court. Either way, the intent, the actions he takes are clear. The shame he feels afterwards is clear. The second question to ask yourself, is there evidence, not clever arguments by skilled counsel, but actual evidence, that Abraham ever questioned the instruction to kill his son, that he hesitated for even a moment? So let's look at that first question. Is there evidence that Abraham intended to kill Isaac? Well, upon being given the instruction by God to sacrifice Isaac, he wakes up first thing in the morning, gathers wood, gets his servants, and heads out for 3 days until he reaches Mount Moriah. Upon reaching the mountain, he doesn't try to delay matters. He doesn't say, you know what, let's camp out here for the night. We can go do this in the morning. He tells his servants, you guys wait here with the donkey, the boy and I are going up there. And when he gets there, he loads up Isaac's back, tiring him out to carry the wood, while Abraham keeps for himself the fire stone and the knife, the two implements you would need to kill someone. If he never intended to kill his son, let Isaac carry the knife and the stone along with everything else. He doesn't do that. He keeps those implements, the weapons needed to kill his son. And when they reach the mountaintop, as I said before, they don't look for a lamb. They don't look for something that God's going to provide them. Why would he? He's already got his sacrifice with him. He doesn't need to look for another one because he was there to sacrifice Isaac, to show his faith in God. Then he builds the altar, and again, he ties Isaac up. I need you to think about that for a moment, because if he knows that he's never going to have to kill his son Isaac, as Professor Dershowitz is saying, if he knows that God is going to stop him, why the charade? Why tie him up? He's not going to have to kill him anyhow. Who cares if he can run away? God's going to provide the lamb. And as other people have mentioned, including some of our esteemed jurors, this is a test of Isaac as well. So why didn't Abraham have faith in Isaac? Why tie him up? The answer is obvious. Because he intends to follow through with it if God asks him to. And even if Professor Dershowitz is right, and Abraham had the idea at first that God would provide a lamb, ask yourself, if God didn't provide that lamb, would Abraham's faith have had him follow through? We are here to defend and prosecute at the same time. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. There's man's law and there's God's law. And just as Abraham achieved the rewards by passing God's test, when it comes to man's test, he failed. And you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have the unfortunate task of saying so, of looking at the facts dispassionately and saying, this is a man of faith. This is a man who is going to follow through on God's will, and he would have sacrificed Isaac. I want to go back also to the actual text. It's clear, and we mentioned it before. He picks up the knife to sharpen it. No, that's not what it says. He picks up the knife to slay Isaac. It's unequivocal. He doesn't say he picks up the knife in his final test of God. He picks up the knife to see what God will do now. He picks up the knife to slay Isaac. It's unequivocal, and there is no room for doubt. Now, the second question, is there any evidence that Abraham questioned the instructions or had ulterior motives? The simple answer is no. There's no evidence. There's no evidence of that at all. There's only argument by counsel that that's what he intended, but all the evidence points in the other direction. In fact, we know that Abraham is not shy about questioning God's decisions, as we've discussed already. When it comes to Sodom, Abraham has no qualms about arguing with God. But God didn't give him a directive there. God didn't test him there. God just told him what he was going to do, and then Abraham took it upon himself, not to challenge God, not to challenge his faith, but to work with God within his faith. Here there's a directive, a specific instruction of what to do, and they're not analogous. Faith, though, is not a justification for his actions against his fellow man. In a few weeks, again, we'll talk about it on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There's two types of commandments, two types of sins, those against God and those against your fellow man. And only God can forgive you for his sins against God. But only man can forgive you your sins against man. Only man can dictate justice between man and man. And that's what we're here for. That's what this court is here to decide. Between man and man, Abraham gets his reward for following God, but he also has to suffer the consequences for breaking man's law. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. And the only way, ladies and gentlemen, that we can pursue justice here tonight, and more importantly, achieve justice here tonight. Justice for Isaac, justice for the people, and yes, even justice for Abraham, not to question his faith, his dedication and devotion to what he believed in and dedicated his life to. To defend all of those, to find justice for all of them, we must find him guilty of the attempted murder of Isaac.
Thank you. Now, traditionally, the prosecution would give an opening argument, the defense would respond, and the prosecution would have a closing argument. But due to the shortness of time, we're going to give Professor Dershowitz the benefit of having the last word. Professor Dershowitz, you may give your closing remarks.
Well, I think it's appropriate for the defense attorney always to get the last word. I've quarreled with the traditional notion if the defense has, if the burden of proof is on the prosecution, the defense should be able to get the last word about reasonable doubt, and I appreciate that for you giving me the last word. What was shocking to me about the brilliant argument made by opponent is he says he's really serving as Abraham's defense attorney, but think about what his defense would have to be. He's basically saying that Abraham is morally equivalent, morally indistinguishable from a child murderer, that we should judge Abraham as if he were a child murderer. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if Abraham is a child murderer, would we be naming the Abraham Accords, peace accords, after Abraham? Would we be calling these religions the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism? No, no, it's because Abraham is not a murderer of children. It's because Abraham ultimately decided to defy God and said, I have faith that you won't ever ask me to kill. If my distinguished opponent is indeed a defense attorney, then his only defense is fundamentalism. His defense is we should praise Abraham because he's a fundamentalist. Because, as Christians put it, I am a fool for Christ. Or there's a comparable Jewish concept, I put aside my seichel, my common sense, for my religion and for God. That's not the kind of Jews we are. We are thoughtful Jews. We are not fundamentalists. We are not unquestioning. We are questioning. The Talmud is the first book ever to preserve dissenting opinions. While other religions were burning heretics, we were honoring them. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. That's my bar mitzvah parsha last week. And my interpretation of tzedek, tzedek is there are multiple definitions of justice. Justice for one is not always justice for all. But the idea that we would have a religion based on a child killing, is just not a suitable response. And that's, of course, the response that the prosecution made, because what he's saying is that Abraham is morally, empirically, legally indistinguishable from a murderer. And indeed, under some religions, attempted murder is the same as murder. That is, if you believe that somebody intended to kill, it's as if that person murdered. So the real question here is Abraham guilty of murder? If he's guilty of attempted murder, he's guilty of murder. And if he's not guilty of murder morally, then he's not guilty of attempted murder. And I don't think anybody in this room believes that. I want to end with a story from the Talmud. There is a story of a rabbi who never said anything negative about anybody, and his students challenged him and said, say something good about atheism. And the rabbi thought for a moment and said, yeah, there's a moment in time when everybody should be an atheist. And the students were shocked. What do you mean you should be an atheist? If you see a hungry man on the street, never say, God will feed him. You have to act as if there is no God, as if you're the only person between that man's hunger and his salvation. And I ask you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to do the same thing. Don't be atheists, of course not. But think that you have to impose human justice. Don't count on God. Now, God knows. God can judge Abraham. We assume Abraham's in heaven, and Abraham has been praised, and Abraham is our patriarch. And so we cannot concede, we cannot conclude that Abraham was a murderer. And yet, according to the prosecution, who claims that he's really defending Abraham, what he's really saying is that Abraham's moral faith justifies his being a murderer, justifies, at least in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the angel, if not in the eyes of a lay jury, but it justifies morally his killing. And I just don't think any of you want to be in the position of justifying Abraham's killing of Isaac. And if you can't justify Abraham's killing of Isaac, then you must conclude, or at least have a reasonable doubt, that Abraham actually would have carried through this brutal act of child murder if not for the intervention of an angel. That angel was his conscience. That angel was his faith in morality, his notion that I, as a human being, have been bestowed with sechel. I've been bestowed with an ability to think. I've been bestowed with a moral judgment. And I, Abraham, cannot allow my moral judgment to be subordinated to the command of a God, not the kind of God I want to worship. The kind of God I want to worship would not want me to kill my son. And that's why Abraham did not kill his son. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, now is the time for you to take just a couple seconds to figure out how you're going to vote. In this case, we're going to do it by a show of hands. Ordinarily, in a criminal action, it would have to be a unanimous jury. But in this case, it's going to be kind of fun to figure out exactly what the numbers are. So, you don't know who you're voting for yet. No, but you have to wait. I'm sorry, you're just going to have to wait. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, how many of you believe that the prosecution has proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt and that Abraham is guilty of attempted murder? Please raise your hand. Whoa. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 38. Okay, I count approximately, give or take, giving the Jewish leeway of mathematics for a lawyer, About 40 people. Okay. How many of you believe that the prosecution has not proven their case? Yeah, no voting twice, and that Abraham is not guilty of attempted murder? Please keep your hands raised, because this time Michael's going to do the more accurate counting. All right, we have a split decision. It's a 2-to-1 ratio. Professor Dershowitz, I apologize. It's a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of the prosecution.
Nope, my appeal, Your Honor.
But what I would like to say is that there really are no winners and losers, because you've been given a lot to think about as Rosh Hashanah approaches. You've been an excellent jury. You're now relieved from jury service for at least 1 year's time, but you may have to come back next year. And to close it up, Michael, take it away.
Michael.
Let's first start with even a little bit more applause for, let's start with Professor Dershowitz, since he can't see us here. Our Judge Cole, who, you know, she was fair, she's tough, but she's accurate. So for Judge Cole. And maybe you guys can give Jimmy a stand-up applause, because he's been studying for the last few months and given his heart and soul. You know, it's not easy going up against Professor Dershowitz, and it was something that Jimmy had decided from many moons ago to do. So I'm so grateful for everyone coming out tonight and making this event possible. Before anyone leaves, by the way, I just want to let you know we're all having dinner together just down in Lower Traub. You'll smell the food as you're walking down. But I want to encourage everyone. We're starting to have meetings back in person. You know, we were gifted tonight with such a knowledgeable and grateful crew, and we look forward to doing it again. And very thankful for making this possible. Jimmy, please.
Just a brief moment. First of all, I want to thank Michael and the Men's Club for sponsoring this and putting this on and giving us the opportunity to be here. I certainly also want to thank the staff at Sinai who made this possible. And obviously, Judge Cole, thank you very much for lending your gravitas to this. But I do want to make a special thank you to Professor Dershowitz, who has been an idol of mine for quite some time, since my father brought back the book in the late 80s. He brought home Chutzpah. And I remember him bringing that back and talking about it. And I want to thank you for the privilege of being allowed to share a program with you. And thank all of you. Thank all of you as well.
Professor Dershowitz, is there anything you'd like to
respond by thanking? Oh, I just want to respond by thanking the prosecutor and by the judge and everybody else, and reminding everybody that the word chutzpah comes from Avraham. It comes from the phrase chutzpah kla'apei shemaya. That is chutzpah even in relation to God in heaven. And so I think that we've all displayed the right amount of chutzpah tonight. And it was a great honor for me to help honor my cousin Tzvi and to help make possible this debate, which I think was a good learning experience for everybody. I learned a lot from the brilliance of the prosecution's presentation. He obviously did an enormous amount of research, Torah research, Talmud research, and his was a legitimate victory. Now, I'm going to appeal, but that should not be in any way negative to the prosecution. We'll see what the appellate court says.
I had home court advantage.
And by the way, a shameless plug for Professor Dershowitz on this exact topic. He is published. So for folks who would like to read more and then, by the way, set time with Jimmy to argue it, you're more than welcome there. So I want to invite everyone to dinner, invite you guys also back on October 6th. We're going to have a City District 5 discussion between the two folks in the runoff. Sam Yebri and Katie Yaroslavsky. And to all the folks who want to ask questions tonight, you will absolutely be able to ask all those questions on that evening. So thank you very much and good night. Thank you.